On the night of the 11th of June, 1982, the commander of British forces in the Falklands stood on a rocky ridge 4 miles from Port Stanley and made a decision that would become one of the most suppressed moments in the entire war. Brigadier Julian Thompson looked at the casualties mounting around him and said words that would not appear in any official history for years. I was on the point of withdrawing my paras from Mount Longdon. We couldn't believe that these teenagers, disguised as soldiers, were causing us to suffer many casualties. The teenagers were Argentine conscripts who had turned Mount Longdon into a 12-hour killing ground. The other teenagers were British paratroopers, 10 of them 17 years old, 42 of them 18 years old, who were being shredded by defensive fire from positions that intelligence had assured them would collapse quickly. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of the Battle of Mount Longdon before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question everything the official histories told you about how that war was won. Now let's go. To understand how 60 British paratroopers ended up charging 300 Argentine defenders on a ridge that should have killed them all, you must first understand what brought both forces to that frozen rock in the South Atlantic and why each side had made catastrophic miscalculations about what the other was capable of doing. The surface version is straightforward enough. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on the 2nd of April, 1982, seizing a British overseas territory that had been disputed for generations.
On the 3rd of April,
the military junta ruling Argentina,
raised the Union Jack on southern
disappearance
Thule.
of up to 30,000
The British
of its own
captured
citizens,
9 Argentines,
seized the islands in a desperate attempt to regain domestic legitimacy through nationalist sentiment. The calculation was simple. Britain was 8,000 miles away, facing domestic economic problems, and would condemn the invasion, but do nothing. That calculation lasted approximately 48 hours before Margaret Thatcher assembled a task force of 127 ships and sent them south. The 3rd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, known as 3 Para, sailed aboard the SS Canberra as part of that force. They were Britain's spearhead battalion, an elite rapid deployment unit theoretically capable of reaching anywhere in the world within a day or 3. In practice, they were about to march 70 kilometers across East Falkland on foot because the transport ship Atlantic Conveyor had been hit by an Exocet missile on the 25th of May, taking most of the task force's helicopters to the bottom with it. Mount Longdon sat 4 miles northwest of Port Stanley, the island's capital, a long east-west ridge of jagged rocks and boulders, rising 210 meters above the surrounding terrain. It was not the highest ground in the area. It was not the most obvious defensive position. What it was, with absolute tactical clarity, was the western hinge of the Argentine defensive ring protecting Port Stanley. And whoever held that ridge controlled the western approaches to the capital. The British plan for the night of the 11th and 12th of June required 3 positions to fall simultaneously: Mount Longdon, 2 Sisters, and Mount Harriet. If any of the 3 held, the advance would stall. 3 Para drew Mount Longdon. Intelligence assessed approximately 280 Argentine soldiers holding the position, mostly conscripts from the 7th Infantry Regiment, with a year of training, backed by Marine platoons. The assessment correctly identified the number. What it catastrophically underestimated was what those defenders had accomplished during their 8 weeks of preparation. The British force approaching Mount Longdon numbered 450 men carrying L1A1 self-loading rifles, the British version of the Belgian FN-FAL. The weapon was reliable, accurate, and semi-automatic only. The Argentine defenders carried the same rifle on full automatic, a distinction that would matter considerably in close-quarters combat, conducted in darkness, at ranges where the difference between controlled fire and suppressive fire was the difference between advancing and dying. The British had L7A2 general-purpose machine guns, 66mm Law rockets, 84mm Carl Gustav recoilless rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Night vision equipment was limited, battery-dependent, insufficient for the entire force. The Argentines had FN MAG machine guns comparable to the British weapons, 81mm and 120mm mortars, 105mm recoilless rifles, and 50 caliber M2HB Browning heavy machine guns positioned across the ridge in mutually supporting fields of fire. The British had no equivalent to the 50 caliber. Argentine Marines carried night vision scopes on their sniper rifles. Racet ground surveillance radar could detect troop movement at ranges up to 10 miles, though the Falklands terrain often limited effective range to 1 to 5 miles. Anti-personnel mines scattered in unmarked fields covered the approaches. Every boulder and crevice had been turned into a fortified position, reinforced with sandbags, barbed wire, and the absolute certainty that the British were coming. The two commanders who would face each other across that ridge had arrived by different paths to the same frozen night. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh William Royston Pike was 39 years old, the son of an Army family, educated at Winchester College, and commissioned into the Parachute Regiment on the 21st of December, 1962. 20 years of preparation had brought him here. Bahrain, the Aden emergency, Northern Ireland repeatedly, commanding A Company in Belfast, mentioned in dispatches for his work on the border. He had taken command of 3 Para on the 30th of June, 1980, and led them through a winter tour in North Armagh and County Fermanagh before the call came in April. He was the type of officer who understood that silent night attacks fail the moment the first mine detonates, and who had made his career on understanding what men look like when they are genuinely afraid, and what they look like when they have moved beyond fear into something more useful. His plan for Mount Longdon was built on that understanding. Silent approach, no preparatory bombardment, close with the enemy before they could organize defensive fire, trust the training and aggression of Paris to carry positions that artillery could not. Major Carlos Eduardo del Valle Carrizo Salvadores was 39 years old, born in San Miguel de Tucumán, raised in Catamarca, commissioned in 1962 from the same generation of officers as Pike, though from a system with considerably less interest in the welfare of its soldiers. He had qualified as a paratrooper, commanded a company in the 17th Airborne Infantry Regiment, and seen action against ERP guerrillas in Catamarca Province. He was the second in command of the 7th Infantry Regiment, which meant he was technically subordinate to the regimental commander, but on Mount Longdon itself, he was the man responsible for everything that happened there. In the days before the battle began, his father died in Catamarca. Carrizo Salvadores kept this information to himself. He did not request compassionate leave. He did not tell his men. He stayed in his command bunker on the eastern end of Mount Longdon and directed the preparations, because that was what professional soldiers did when the personal and the tactical collided, and only one of them could be accommodated. The defensive preparations were extensive. 1st Platoon, under Sub-Lieutenant Juan Domingo Baldini, held the western slopes, the positions that would receive the initial British assault. 2nd Platoon, under 1st Sergeant Raul Roberto Gonzalez, held the northern approaches. 3rd Platoon, under Senior Lieutenant Enrique Eneas Neiroti, covered the southern side. Marine Sub-Lieutenant Sergio Andres Dakari had arrived in the week before the battle to coordinate the Marine manned heavy machine guns and sniper teams scattered across the ridge. The positions were not hasty field fortifications. They were bunkers reinforced with whatever materials 8 weeks of waiting could accumulate, positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire across every approach, mutually supporting so that an assault on one position would be engaged by fire from 2 or 3 others simultaneously. The rocks themselves provided natural cover, but the Argentines had improved on nature with sandbags and excavation, and the kind of attention to tactical detail that comes from knowing with absolute certainty that your life depends on the thoroughness of your preparations. Sergeant Roque Antonio Nista operated the Racet radar from a position with clear observation over the western approaches, His equipment had been picking up British patrols for a week. The week of watching began on the 3rd of June, when Captain Matthew Selfridge and Captain Robbie Burns established a patrol base near Monoray Bridge, 2 kilometers west of Mount Longdon. The base was protected by 4 platoon under Lieutenant Ian Bickerdike and served as the staging point for reconnaissance patrols sent to scout the Argentine positions. On the night of the 4th and 5th of June, Corporal Jerry Phillips and Privates Richard Absolon and Bill Hayward moved to the northern slopes with orders to infiltrate Baldini's platoon and capture a prisoner. They were supported by 6 105mm field guns positioned to provide covering fire if the patrol made contact. The snipers shot at Baldini's positions and fired a 66mm anti-tank rocket at a mortar pit. Argentine response was immediate and accurate. Machine gun fire, artillery, and mortars that forced the patrol to withdraw without a prisoner and without casualties on either side. What the patrol accomplished was confirmation that the defenders were alert, that their reaction times were professional, and that their indirect fire was well registered and effective. The night of the 6th and 7th of June brought a fighting patrol from the 601 Commando Company investigating British activity near Monoray Bridge. They came under fire from 3 sections of Paris. The Argentine commandos counterattacked and found rucksacks and a radio set with signal instructions, confirming what Sergeant Nista's radar had already indicated. A major assault was imminent. Lance Corporal John Hare of 2 Troop, Royal Engineers, was seriously wounded during one of these patrols. Terry Peck, a former member of the Falkland Islands Defense Force who had stayed on the islands after the invasion, participated in the reconnaissance operations with a combination of local knowledge and improvisation that included pretending to be lost on his motorbike so he could talk to Argentine guards. In one incident, he accidentally fired on Sergeant John Pettinger's standing patrol from D Company, 3 Para, but Pettinger's men held their fire when they recognized the patrol, and no one was hurt. The week of watching ended with both sides understanding the situation perfectly. The British were coming, the Argentines knew they were coming, and the only variable remaining was the exact hour of the attack. By the evening of the 10th of June, 1982, 450 British paratroopers and 278 Argentine defenders were separated by 2 kilometers of open ground and approximately 24 hours. Among the 450 British paratroopers preparing to attack Mount Longdon were 10 soldiers who were 17 years old and 42 who were 18 years old. The Argentine force defending the ridge included conscripts of similar ages. Private Neil Gross was about to turn 18 years old on the 12th of June. Private Jason Burt was 17. Private Ian Scrivens was 17. None of them were old enough to drink legally in an American bar. All of them were about to become participants in what would later be described as the bloodiest British ground action since the Korean War. The rifles they carried, the grenades hanging from their webbing, the bayonets they would fix before crossing the start line. These were the same tools soldiers had carried for decades. What was about to happen to them was older than any of that, as old as fortified positions and attacking infantry and the mathematics of taking defended high ground at night against an enemy who has had time to prepare and no intention of retreating. Final preparations began at 1900 hours on the 11th of June. Bayonets were fixed. Ammunition was checked. Company commanders gathered their platoon leaders and section commanders and went through the plan one final time. B Company under Major Mike Argue would assault the western positions, the objectives designated fly half and wing forward. A company under Major David Collette would follow through and assault the eastern objective, full back, once B Company had secured their positions. Support Company would provide covering fire with their machine guns and mortars. D Company was already forward at the patrol base. The plan was silence, 2000 hours. The assault companies crossed the Monoray River and began moving across the open ground toward Mount Longdon, temperature below freezing. Sleet reduced visibility. The ground was boggy peat that made movement difficult and noise discipline harder. The men moved in assault formation with weapons ready, advancing as quietly as 450 soldiers can advance across open ground in the dark toward an enemy who has radar and night vision and has been watching for a week. Sergeant Roque Nista's radar tracked the movement. Argentine platoons stood too. Major Carrizo Salvadores was informed. The defenders waited. 20-15 hours. One British NCO stepped on an anti-personnel mine. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic to the plan. Sub-Lieutenant Juan Baldini's 1st platoon launched a withering hail of fire toward the advancing British. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness from dozens of positions simultaneously. The element of surprise, which Pike's entire plan had depended upon, disappeared in the space between the detonation and the first burst of automatic rifle fire. Pike decided to continue. 6th Platoon on the right flank of B Company captured the western half of Fly Half with minimal resistance. They had not been abandoned. They had been missed. Half a dozen Argentine conscripts from Baldini's platoon, who had taken cover in bunkers that 6th Platoon had grenaded, but not cleared, launched a fierce counterattack on the British who had passed their positions. Casualties were taken before the area was finally cleared, and the Argentines killed or captured. 5 Platoon came under heavy fire from Argentine machine gun positions that had clear fields of fire across the northern approaches. The platoon was pinned down until Privates Ben Goff and Dominic Gray took the initiative that would later earn them both mentions in dispatches. They crawled to an Argentine bunker under fire, threw grenades through the firing slit, and jumped into the bunker the instant the grenades detonated. What followed was hand-to-hand combat, conducted with bayonets in a space too confined for rifles to be useful. Private Gray killed a Marine by sticking his bayonet through his eye socket. Both men survived. One machine gun was silenced by Carl Gustav, and Law anti-tank rockets fired at the bunker from a distance. 20 minutes into an assault that was supposed to be silent, the rocks of Mount Longdon were lit by muzzle flashes from 300 positions, and the British were advancing into fire that was coming from everywhere at once. 4 Platoon was ordered to clear enemy positions from the long east-west ridge feature held in depth by well-concealed machine gun positions. The platoon advanced and came under increasingly heavy fire. Marine Corporal Carlos Rafael Colomil, operating as a sniper with a night vision scope, shot a British soldier who was giving orders and hit 2 more soldiers in rapid succession. In a central bunker fortified beyond what the British had encountered on the western positions, Marines Jorge Maciel and Claudio Scaglione manned a heavy machine gun, while Marines Luis Fernandez and Sergio Giuseppetti provided covering fire with night-scoped rifles. 50 caliber positions that the patrols had identified, but that intelligence had not adequately warned about opened fire. 4 Platoon took casualties. The advance slowed. Lieutenant Ian Bickerdike realized that no further progress could be made from their exposed position and ordered the platoon to seek cover among the rocks of the ridge itself, where they linked up with elements of 5 Platoon. The platoon sergeant of 4 Platoon was Sergeant Ian John McKay, 29 years old, from Wortley near Barnsley in South Yorkshire. During the sea crossing from England, he had written a letter that said, "I have no intention of taking any risks and getting killed. If I do, then it will be to protect my men, to save lives." An hour before the assault began, he had told Company Sergeant Major John Weeks, "I am not going to come back from this." Weeks had heard it, and both men had moved on. McKay had joined the Army in August of 1970 at age 17 and been posted to 1 Para in early 1971. He had served in Northern Ireland during a period that included the 30th of January, 1972, the day that would become known as Bloody Sunday. He had been a corporal instructor at the depot, served with 3 Para, returned to the depot for another stint, and come back to 3 Para in February of 1982 as the platoon sergeant of 4 Platoon, B Company. He had a wife named Maritza, who had packed his dinner in a Tupperware container the night he left, because he had barely enough time to say he had to go. The 28 men in his platoon were his responsibility. What McKay was looking at from his position among the rocks was a tactical problem that required immediate solution. 4 and 5 platoons were pinned down, casualties were mounting, and the Marine machine gun positions dominating the ridge were preventing any advance. Lieutenant Bickerdike decided to move forward with Sergeant McKay, a corporal, and a few others, to reconnoiter the enemy positions under covering fire from the platoon's machine guns. As they moved forward, Bickerdike and his signaller were both hit. Bickerdike took a bullet in the leg. Command devolved to McKay. The situation was clear. Instant action was needed if the advance was not to falter and increasing casualties to ensue. McKay made his decision. He would convert the reconnaissance into an attack to eliminate the enemy positions. He was in no doubt of the strength and deployment of the enemy as he undertook this attack. He issued orders. He took 3 men with him: Corporal Ian Bailey, Private Jason Burt, who was 17 years old, and another private. They broke cover and charged the enemy position. The assault was met with a hail of fire. Corporal Bailey was seriously wounded. Private Jason Burt was killed. The other private was wounded. McKay continued to charge the enemy position alone. He reached it and dispatched the enemy with grenades, thereby relieving the position of beleaguered 4 and 5 platoons, who were now able to redeploy with relative safety. Sergeant McKay was killed at the moment of victory, his body falling on the bunker. The Marine position was eliminated, but the cost had been devastating. Bailey was seriously wounded, but alive, and would later be awarded the Military Cross. Burt was dead at 17 years old. McKay was dead at 29. Sergeant Fuller, the senior NCO in company headquarters, volunteered to take command of 4 Platoon and combined the remnants with a section from 5 Platoon to continue the advance. 4 and 5 platoons attempted to push forward toward their objective of wing forward, but came under heavy fire from Argentine positions on the eastern end of Mount Longdon and could not move any further without taking losses that would render the company combat ineffective. Major Mike Argue, commanding B Company, made the decision that company commanders are paid to make when the tactical mathematics no longer support continuation. He ordered 4 and 5 platoons to withdraw under covering fire. Another man was killed during the withdrawal, and others were wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Pike and his command group arrived on the scene, and Argue briefed him on the situation. Company Sergeant Major Weeks reported that both platoons had pulled back to a safe distance and that all the wounded had been recovered. The dead, however, had to be left where they had fallen. HMS Avenger, a Type 21 frigate positioned offshore, began pounding Fly-Half with its 4.5-inch gun. The naval gunfire was heavy enough to suppress some of the Argentine positions, but not heavy enough to eliminate them. Pike ordered a company under Major David Collett to move through the exhausted B Company and assault full back from the west. Fresh troops would go against positions that had now been alerted and reinforced and were waiting. Major Collett's A Company had been in reserve for 4 hours, listening to the sounds of B Company dying in the dark. Now came the order everyone knew was inevitable. On the eastern end of Mount Longdon, in his command bunker on full back, Major Carlos Carrizo Salvadores was on the radio to regimental headquarters in Port Stanley, requesting infantry reinforcements. Around midnight on the 12th of June, Carrizo Salvadores received his answer. He was given a rifle platoon from Captain Hugo Garcia's C Company. Lieutenant Raul Fernando Castaneda gathered the sections of his platoon, 46 men total, and moved toward Mount Longdon. They hooked around 1st Sergeant Raul Gonzalez's 2nd Platoon, already engaged with the British, and delivered a counterattack around 0200 hours. The platoon fought with great courage in fierce hand-to-hand combat. The battle raged for another stretch as Castaneda's men closed with 4 and 5 platoons. In the darkness among the rocks, where the distinction between friend and enemy was determined by silhouette and voice and split-second decisions, part of Castaneda's platoon, under the direction of an NCO, converged on the British regimental aid post where the wounded from B Company were being treated. Color Sergeant Brian Faulkner saw that more than 20 wounded paras on the western slopes were about to fall into the hands of the Argentine section and deployed anyone fit enough to defend the aid post. He picked 4 men and got up on a high feature overlooking the approach. A section of 15 riflemen from Castaneda's platoon were coming toward them. Faulkner's group opened fire. How many they killed, Faulkner would later say, they did not know, but none of the Argentines were left standing when the firing stopped. The aid post held. The wounded stayed in British hands. Castaneda's platoon, having fought for hours against British positions that would not break, began to withdraw. Individual acts of heroism on the Argentine side during this phase would later be documented and recognized. Corporal Manuel Medina of Castaneda's platoon, already wounded, took over a recoilless rifle detachment and personally fired along the ridge at Support Company. He killed 3 paras, including Private Peter Hedeker, who took the full force of the 105mm round, and wounded 3 others before continuing to fight despite his wounds. Private Leonardo Rondi dodged groups of paras to deliver messages to Castaneda's section leaders, engaged in a gunfight with British paratroopers, shot one of them, and grabbed the dead man's red beret and SLR as a trophy that he later gave to Major Carrizo Salvadores. Rondi would be awarded the Gallantry in Combat Medal. Sub-Lieutenant Juan Domingo Baldini, commanding 1st Platoon on the western slopes, died attempting to fix a jammed machine gun during the fighting. His body was found later with his weapon and boots removed, the boots taken by British soldiers who needed them. A photo of the dead lieutenant appeared in the original hardback edition of a book published in 1985. Carrizo Salvadores would later recommend Baldini for the Heroic Valor Cross, the Argentine equivalent of the Victoria Cross, but Baldini received the lesser decoration of the Gallantry in Combat Medal instead. Sergeant Rolando Mario Spizzuocco displayed heroism by rescuing most of 1st Platoon's wounded conscripts from the forward positions and carrying them back through what he would later describe as a nightmare of shot and shell to a place of relative safety. He too received the Gallantry in Combat Medal. By 0400 hours on the 12th of June, the counterattack had spent itself against the rocks and the rifles of men who had been fighting for 8 hours and would not break. Castaneda's survivors, 21 men out of the 46 who had entered the counterattack, disappeared into the darkness toward the eastern positions. Major Mike Argue's B Company ceased firing and devoted their full efforts to withdrawing their wounded and consolidating what they had captured. During the withdrawal, Corporal Stuart McLaughlin was injured by a recoilless rifle round, fired from Rough Diamond, a position northwest of Mount Longdon. As he was being moved to the aid post, both McLaughlin and Lance Corporal Pete Higgs were killed by an 81mm mortar round fired by 1st Sergeant Mario Ricardo Alcaide's platoon. HMS Avenger continued to pound the Argentine positions. Artillery from 79 Battery, 29 Commando Regiment Royal Artillery added its weight. 30 minutes after the last of Castaneda's men withdrew, a company began their advance on full back. Major David Collett commanded a company. Lieutenant David Wright and 2nd Lieutenant Ian Moore led their platoons forward, under covering fire from Support Company and the continuing bombardment from Avenger. They were advancing from the west toward the eastern objective against positions that had not yet been seriously tested, and that Carrizo Salvadores had been reinforcing and preparing. The assault was close quarters fighting conducted with grenades, rifles, and bayonets, clearing bunkers one at a time because there was no other way to take fortified positions in rocky terrain at night. Argentine resistance was fierce despite the hours of combat. Marine positions were still active. Recoilless rifle fire from Wireless Ridge, the position immediately adjacent to Mount Longdon, was hitting a company as they advanced. Every bunker had to be cleared individually. Every position had to be confirmed, secure, before the advance could continue. There was no mass retreat by the defenders. What there was instead was disciplined withdrawal by fire and movement, fighting from one position until it became untenable, and then falling back to the next prepared position. Around 0600 hours, a Milan anti-tank missile was fired at the Argentine command positions on full back. The missile smashed into rocks just behind Major Carrizo Salvadores' command bunker. British paratroopers were within 100 meters of his position. The tactical situation no longer supported continued defense. Carrizo Salvadores ordered a withdrawal. Argentine troops on the eastern end began moving back toward Port Stanley in the pre-dawn darkness. Some positions continued firing to cover the withdrawal. When Major Collette entered the abandoned command bunker, he found 2,000 cigarettes that Carrizo Salvadores had left behind. Collette gave the cigarettes to the smokers in his company. He also found maps and communications equipment that documented how the defense had been coordinated. By 0700 hours on the 12th of June, Mount Longdon was in British hands. The battle had lasted 12 hours. Daylight revealed the scope of what had been purchased. Lance Corporal Vincent Bramley, patrolling the western half of Mount Longdon in the dawn light, was confronted with the full horror of night combat. He found the bodies of 5 British paratroopers. He would later describe the sadness and anger he felt. The company sergeant major looked very tired from seeing so many of his men hurt or killed. Bodies lay on the rocks, in bunkers, in trenches, in positions where they had fallen during the 12 hours of fighting. The wounded from both sides were being evacuated. The count began. 17 members of 3 Para had been killed during the battle. 1 Royal Engineer attached to 3 Para, Corporal Scott Wilson, had been killed. 6 more would die of their wounds aboard the hospital ship SS Uganda in the hours and days following. The total dead from the 3 Para battle group would reach 23. Among the dead were 2 17-year-olds, Private Jason Burt, killed in Sergeant McKay's charge, and Private Ian Scrivens. Private Neil Gross had been killed on his 18th birthday. Sergeant Ian McKay, 29 years old from Wortley near Barnsley, was dead on the bunker where he had fallen. Private Peter Hedeker had taken the full force of Corporal Medina's recoilless rifle round. Corporal Stuart McLaughlin and Lance Corporal Pete Higgs had been killed by the same mortar round en route to the aid post. 43 to 47 British paratroopers had been wounded, many with life-changing injuries, including lost limbs, gunshot wounds, and shrapnel wounds that would require years of treatment. In the hours and days following the battle, Argentine artillery and mortar fire targeted the British positions on Mount Longdon. 4 additional paras were killed in this shelling. 1 Remy craftsman was killed. 7 more paratroopers were wounded. On the Argentine side, 31 soldiers had been killed during the defense of Mount Longdon. Sub-Lieutenant Juan Baldini was among them. Corporal Dario Rios had been found dead, lying with his platoon commander. Cavalry Sergeant Jorge Alberto Ron had been killed in the initial fighting. Lieutenant Alberto Rolando Ramos, the forward artillery observer, had sent his last message that his position was surrounded before he was killed. Lieutenant Castaneda's platoon had entered the counterattack with 46 men and withdrawn with 21 survivors. 25 men killed or wounded in several hours, a casualty rate of 54%. 120 Argentine soldiers had been wounded. 50 had been taken prisoner. Corporal Ian Bailey, seriously wounded in McKay's charge, had survived and would be awarded the Military Cross. He would be one of the last two to see McKay alive, and would help carry McKay's coffin when the bodies were brought home. Lieutenant Ian Bickerdike, shot in the leg during the reconnaissance, had been evacuated and would survive his wounds. In Port Stanley, on the night of the 11th of June, 3 civilian women had been killed when a British artillery shell accidentally landed on the house where they were sheltering. Susan Whitley was 30 years old, a British citizen. Doreen Bonner was 36 years old, a Falkland Islander. Mary Goodwin was 81 years old, a Falkland Islander. The shell was never meant for them. The battle was never meant to come to their house. They died anyway. The counting was complete. 23 British soldiers dead, 31 Argentine soldiers dead, 3 civilian women dead, 120 Argentine wounded, 47 British wounded. And the question that nobody in London or Buenos Aires could answer was whether any of it had been worth what the rocks had cost. What the 23 British dead and the 31 Argentine dead had purchased with their lives was the end of the war. Mount Longdon had fallen. 2 sisters had fallen to 45 Commando. Mount Harriet had fallen to 42 Commando. All 3 objectives of the coordinated night attack on the 11th and 12th of June had been achieved. The Argentine defensive ring protecting Port Stanley was broken. The path to the capital was open. On the night of the 13th and 14th of June, 2 Para attacked Wireless Ridge immediately adjacent to Mount Longdon. They were supported by lessons learned. Massive artillery bombardment preceded the assault, with 6,000 rounds fired from 105mm guns over 12 to 14 hours from land and sea positions. The Blues and Royals light tanks with their 76mm and 30mm guns provided direct fire support. 2 Para, still carrying the memory of the 80 casualties they had sustained at Goose Green, including the loss of their commanding officer, took no unnecessary chances. Lieutenant Colonel Omar Jimenez, commanding the Argentine 7th Infantry Regiment, would later say that he was nearly killed by direct hits 3 or 4 times during the bombardment. Wireless Ridge fell with lighter British casualties than Mount Longdon had cost. Near the church in Stanley, Major Carrizo Salvadores made his last attempt to influence the outcome. Helped by the chaplain Father Jose Fernandez, he mustered about 50 survivors from Wireless Ridge and led them in a bayonet charge toward the British positions, the men chanting the Malvinas March as they advanced. They were stopped by heavy artillery and machine gun fire. Major Philip Neame of 2 Para would later describe it as quite a sporting effort, but one without a sporting chance. It was the last organized Argentine resistance outside Port Stanley. Morning of the 14th of June, the remaining Argentine defenses collapsed. General Mario Menendez, commanding the Argentine forces on the islands, realized that his position was no longer tenable. White flags appeared across Port Stanley. Surrender negotiations began. The 10-week war was over. Mount Longdon had been described by multiple British commanders as the toughest battle of the 3 simultaneous attacks. It was the bloodiest British ground action since the Korean War. Brigadier Julian Thompson's admission that he had been on the point of withdrawing his Paris because he could not believe that teenage conscripts were causing such casualties would not become public knowledge until years later. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his cool example and inspiring leadership. The recommendation came from Thompson and was very strongly recommended by Major General Jeremy Moore, Lieutenant General Sir Richard Trant, and Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse. The tactical lessons identified in the aftermath were straightforward. Silent night attacks are extremely difficult to maintain when anti-personnel mines are present. One mine detonation had compromised Pike's entire plan. Defensive positions on rocky terrain are devastating to assault forces, even when the defenders are outnumbered and the attackers are elite troops. The .50 caliber heavy machine gun represented a critical capability gap for the British that was noted and would later be addressed. Night vision equipment disparity had been significant, with Argentine Marines and engineers possessing capabilities that exceeded what the British force had available. The full auto capability of the Argentine FN-FL rifles had provided a major advantage over the British semi-automatic SLRs in close-quarters combat. Prepared defensive positions, held by determined troops who have had weeks to fortify and who are defending ground they believe is their own, are extremely dangerous, regardless of whether those troops are labeled as conscripts or professionals. The British had learned these lessons. The Argentines had proved them. Both sides had paid for that education in blood. The war was won. The Falkland Islands remained British. The military junta in Argentina would fall within a year, replaced by democratic government. Margaret Thatcher's political position was secured. The principle that military aggression would be met with military response had been demonstrated at the far end of a supply line that stretched across half the world. And the distance between what was accomplished and what it cost to accomplish it was measured in the bodies of teenagers scattered across a ridge that most people in Britain had never heard of before the 12th of June, 1982, and would not remember the name of 10 years later. Which brings us to what happened after the cameras stopped. Sergeant Ian McKay's Victoria Cross was announced on the 8th of October, 1982. The citation, published in the London Gazette, emphasized his complete disregard for his own safety based on eyewitness accounts from survivors of his platoon. His wife, Marika, received the Victoria Cross at Buckingham Palace on the 9th of November, 1982. McKay was buried at Aldershot Military Cemetery, along with 15 comrades from the battle. His Victoria Cross was the last awarded in the 20th century, the final recognition of that particular form of courage in the 100 years between 1900 and 2000. In 1989, Marika McKay sold the medals privately to Lord Michael Ashcroft. The decision was hers to make, and the reasons were her own. The battlefield itself was preserved. Mount Longdon remains largely as it was that morning. The sangars are still visible. The bunkers remain. The blood is gone, but the memory is carved into the stones in the form of memorials that stand where men died. A memorial to Sergeant Ian McKay, VC, stands at the site where he fell. A memorial to B Company, 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, stands on the western positions they captured. Argentine memorials mark the areas where their soldiers fought and died, including the location of a temporary burial ground. In the United Kingdom, the McKay VC Gymnasium at Vimy Barracks in Catterick Garrison bears his name. The McKay VC Bar at Mount Pleasant Airport in the Falklands keeps his memory present. The National Memorial Arboretum includes plaques commemorating the battle and the men who fought it. The Parachute Regiment Museum maintains exhibits and records. On the 40th anniversary in 2022, McKay Close was named in Stanley, and a street bearing his name was established at the Mount Pleasant complex. The story of the battle was told in books written by men who had been there. Vincent Bramley, who had found the 5 bodies that morning, wrote a memoir called Forward into Hell that provided a first-person account of what 3 Para had experienced. John Cooksey published 3 Para Mount Longdon, the bloodiest battle through pen and sword in 2004, drawing on military records and interviews. James O'Connell, who had been wounded in action at Longdon, spent years working to get posthumous medals and memorials for his comrades, and published 3 Days in June through Monoray in 2022, incorporating eyewitness accounts and battalion radio logs. Mark Isles Thomas, who had fought as a 17-year-old paratrooper at Longdon, wrote Sod That for a Game of Soldiers for Kenton Publishing in 2007. Hugh Baceno's Razor's Edge in 2006 provided extensive research, including Argentine sources. Peter Harklerode's History of the Parachute Regiment included detailed analysis with access to the war diary. a television docudrama in 2006 called Victoria Cross. Heroes profiled McKay with archive footage, dramatizations, and an interview with his mother. In September of 2022, something happened that would have seemed impossible on the night of the 11th of June, 1982. Mark Iles Thomas, the 17-year-old paratrooper who had fought at Mount Longdon, traveled to Argentina with his wife Patricia. The purpose of the visit was to return the helmet of an Argentine soldier named Daniel Francisco Sertori, who had committed suicide in the post-war period, to Sertori's daughter Virginia. The Argentine embassy in London facilitated the meeting, while in Argentina, Iles Thomas met retired Colonel Carlos Carrizo Salvadores and his wife Norma. The two men who had spent that night trying to kill each other sat down to dinner together. Not once, but multiple times, at the exclusive Circulo Militar and aboard the museum ship, ARA Presidente Sarmiento. They recounted their experiences. They shared memories of men who had died and men who had survived. 40 years after the killing had stopped, they found that the distance between them was smaller than the distance between what they had both experienced and what anyone who had not been there could understand. What official history emphasized in the years that followed was the strategic victory, the excellence of the parachute regiment, McKay's Victoria Cross, the swift conclusion after Mount Longdon fell, and the liberation of British territory from military occupation. What official history underplayed or omitted entirely was how close the British had come to withdrawal when Thompson stood on the ridge, considering pulling his paras out. The extent of Argentine defensive capability was mentioned, but not emphasized. The ages of the combatants on both sides, 10 17-year-olds and 42 18-year-olds among 3 para, similar ages on the Argentine side, appeared in some accounts, but not others. Individual Argentine heroism, the actions of Corporal Medina firing his recoilless rifle while wounded, Private Rondi dodging through enemy positions, Sub-Lieutenant Baldini dying at his machine gun, the courage of Castaneda's platoon sustaining 54% casualties, received recognition in Argentine military histories, but less attention in British accounts. The 3 civilian women killed by British artillery appeared in casualty lists, but not in narratives focused on military action. The post-battle Argentine shelling that killed 5 more British soldiers appeared in detailed unit histories, but not in popular accounts. The full extent of the close-quarters brutality, the bayonet fighting, the hand-to-hand combat in bunkers too confined for rifles, the grenades thrown into fighting positions occupied by men barely old enough to vote, received factual documentation, but not the kind of descriptive attention that would have made the violence real to readers who had not experienced it. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike relinquished command of 3 para in 1983 and continued his career through increasingly senior positions. He eventually rose to lieutenant general, was appointed Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath in 1997, served as GOC and Director of Operations in Northern Ireland from 1998 to 2000, and retired on the 14th of March, 2001. He wrote about his family history, including the Falklands, in a book called From the Front Line, Family Letters and Diaries. Major Carlos Carrizo Salvadores retired as a colonel, became police chief of Jujuy province in Argentina, faced legal proceedings related to the Capilla del Rosario incident that resulted in a life sentence later overturned by an Argentine high court in 2016, and in 2022 sat down to dinner with the British veteran, who had been trying to kill him 40 years earlier. Vincent Bramley left the army and spent decades processing what he had witnessed before writing his memoir. James O'Connell has lived in Merseyside since leaving the army and has dedicated significant effort since 2014 to ensuring that the men who fought at Mount Longdon receive the recognition they deserve. The Falkland Islands Museum and National Trust now conducts tours of the Mount Longdon battlefield. visitors can walk the steep northern approach that became known as Grenade Alley. The memorials are maintained. Argentine graves and British memorials stand side by side. The rocks and bunkers are largely unchanged. Spent ammunition is occasionally still found. The landscape itself has become a memorial, preserved through the isolation of the islands, and the respect both sides have shown for ground that cost so much. The ongoing debates continue in both countries. In Argentina, veterans groups including CISIM, founded by former conscripts of the 7th Regiment, continue to advocate for recognition that their officers were inadequate, that the conscripts fought without proper leadership or support, and that the Argentine military establishment has not adequately honored the men who held the positions under fire. The question of whether British intelligence adequately assessed the enemy has been largely answered by Thompson's admission that he nearly withdrew his forces. The question of whether Mount Longdon could have been bypassed has been answered by every subsequent military analysis. The high ground had to be taken. 43 years after the battle, the rocks of Mount Longdon look much as they did that morning. The sangars are still there. The bunkers are still there. The blood is gone, but the memory is carved into the stones themselves. And the question that nobody could answer in the freezing dawn has an answer now, written in the decades since. It mattered. Not because the islands remained British, or because the junta fell, or because the war was won. It mattered because 450 British paratroopers and 278 Argentine defenders proved something about what human beings are capable of enduring and inflicting when preparation meets courage, and the only choice left is to stand or die. They stood, both of them. And that is what Mount Longdon means. Brigadier Julian Thompson stood on that ridge and nearly ordered a withdrawal because he could not believe the teenagers disguised as soldiers were causing such casualties. What Thompson did not understand in that moment was that both sides were teenagers, and both sides were soldiers. And the disguise was the label, not the reality. The Argentine defenders were not poorly trained conscripts who would collapse under pressure. They were men who had spent weeks turning rocks into fortresses, and who fought with the determination of soldiers defending ground they believed belonged to their country. The British paratroopers were not invincible. They were professionals who learned that courage and training do not stop 50 caliber rounds or eliminate the advantage that fortified high ground provides to defenders who have had time to prepare. 60 British paratroopers from B Company charged into 300 Argentine defenders on a ridge that should have killed them all. It nearly did. 23 British dead, 31 Argentine dead, 120 Argentine wounded, 47 British wounded. Sergeant Ian McKay charging alone into machine gun fire to save his platoon, and dying on the bunker at the moment he cleared it. Corporal Manuel Medina firing a recoilless rifle with wounds that should have incapacitated him. Lieutenant Castaneda leading 46 men into a counterattack and bringing 21 back. Teenagers killing teenagers because politicians thousands of miles away had made decisions that required bodies to resolve. The real history of Mount Longdon is not the history of the war that was won or the islands that remained British. The real history is written in the distance between what commanders expected their soldiers could do and what those soldiers actually did when expectation collided with reality on a freezing ridge in the South Atlantic. Mount Longdon mattered because it revealed a truth that official histories would prefer to leave on the rocks where it was learned. There are no easy victories against determined defenders on ground they have prepared and are willing to die for. The British learned it. The Argentines proved it. Both sides paid for that education in blood. Private Jason Burt never came home. He was 17 years old. Sergeant Ian McKay never came home. He was 29 years old. 31. Argentine soldiers whose names are carved into memorials in Argentina never came home. The rocks of Mount Longdon are still there. The memorials are still there. The lesson is still there. And if you believe that the men who stood on that ridge deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below.